Alright guys, I'm back with round 7 of my recent tournament, the Bay Area International. Here I was paired with International Master Leon Piasetski from Canada. I've seen him at many tournaments before. He plays a lot of open events, but this is actually the first time we've ever played. Okay, so I started with d4, knight f6, c4, e6, knight f3, and b6. He goes for the Queen's Indian. I was definitely expecting this. Before the game, this is one of his main openings, and I'm not sure exactly how deeply he prepared, because I just don't remember how many games I have with b3 in the database, but it seemed like he wasn't too surprised by all this. So he goes bishop b4 check. This is a pretty common idea for black, bishop d2, and pulls back to e7. Then I played knight c3. The point of playing this move before actually going bishop g2 is quite important, because here I'm really threatening to play e4 and black doesn't have time to play c6, because then white just plays e4. I mean, black can play that, but it's kind of a different line. If white were to play bishop g2 here, then black could play c6, knight c3, d5, and the difference here is that with black having already played c6, if white plays c takes d5 here, black most likely takes with the c-pawn and gets a pretty solid position for this kind of structure. Bishop on a6 is good, knight can come out to c6, and black is doing perfectly fine. So the point of knight c3 is to just threaten e4 right away. Black is kind of obliged to play d5 to prevent this, but now when I take, black has to take with the e-pawn, and we're getting a different structure here where black is left with the c-pawn that in some cases becomes a little bit backwards and weak. But nevertheless, this is still a very solid line for black. So bishop g2, castles, and he played bishop b7. Black has a couple different plans in the position. This one with bishop b7 and knight a6 is pretty typical, and then black plays for c5. Other ideas include like rook e8 and then bringing the knight to d7 and back to f8. So there are a lot of different ways to play the position. From white's point of view, I'm usually putting the queen on c2. This rook goes to d1, this rook will typically go to c1, and then bishop goes to f4, and white slowly tries to advance and take more space, and try to put pressure along the c file and on the d5 pawn. So these positions are really interesting, and I definitely favor white here. Although, again, it's a theoretical position, so of course black is objectively fine. Bishop b7, queen c2, knight a6, rook f d1, and queen c8. This is a pretty thematic move. Black typically puts the queen on e6 in this kind of position. It's just well placed there, and then they'll even play h6 so that there's no knight g5 ideas. So I continue with my plan, bishop f4, c5, and here I decided to play queen to b2. I think this is a useful move because now I'm preparing to play rook c1, and I'm just kind of stepping the queen out of the way, so I'm not getting hit with any knight b4s. I'm stepping off of the c-file, and in general the queen on b2 ends up being well placed in this structure. Whenever I take on c5, then the queen is kind of opened up on this long diagonal, which can be useful, and in many cases the queen supports some kind of b4 push. So I found in my experience the queen just sits very nicely on b2 here. So black plays h6, rook ac1, queen e6, and I decided to play h4. This is a pretty typical move here for white as well. I'm preventing black from being able to play g5 and push my bishop back. This is definitely an important idea. And white's other point here is to just keep the pawn on d4 very stable. So I'm always inviting black to take on d4 so I can recapture with a tempo, or even in many cases play knight to b5 and then take back with that knight. And I have a couple more stabilizing moves left. I can also insert a move like a3 just to take control over the b4 square. I can play a move like e3. So white has ways here to improve the position. Knight can definitely jump to e5 as well. Black played knight to e4, and here I probably should have just taken on c5 right away. Now black has a choice how to recapture. If black takes with the piece, like with bishop takes c5, this looks tempting because you get this tempo against the f2 pawn, but white will just happily play e3 here, and then I'm well in control over the blockading square on d4. My other knight can jump to b5. And I also have ideas of playing, let's say, knight b5 and then bishop e5 and back to d4. And so white is just fully in control here. Instead, after dc5, I'm presuming black would likely play b takes c5. And then after something like knight takes e4, d takes e4, knight d2, this is really similar to the structure, actually almost identical, I had in a previous game in this tournament against Somilwar. I think that was round 5, if you want to check that out if you haven't seen that video yet. And I definitely like white structure here better than black's here. The e4 pawn, the c5 pawn, and the a7 pawn, they're all kind of weaknesses, and black's pieces aren't placed too great. But there are still some chances here for black. I don't think it's as bad as it was in the previous game. Here black's position looks a little bit more flexible. Nevertheless, white is slightly better there, and I probably just should have gone for that. Instead, I played this move e3, and this turned out to be an extremely provocative move. I mean, the move is logical. I'm just trying to keep really good control over the d4 square, but it is provocative in that it's shutting off my bishop on f4. So now if black is ever able to achieve g5, then my bishop is in danger of getting trapped. Now the immediate g5 is not quite working. I can take once on g5, h takes g5, and then take on e4. And then after d takes e4, I'm simply taking the pawn on g5 and just having a winning position. And if black instead takes the bishop after knight takes e4, I can throw in this move knight to g5, which is a nice resource. Hitting the queen, and it doesn't matter if black takes first or doesn't, just plays a move like queen g6. I'm either going to recapture, but eventually I'm just going to take the pawn on f4, like e takes f4. And I think white is just going to be a very healthy pawn up there. And just super stable position. So these lines aren't really working for black. Instead, I mean, black really should have just made, I think, some kind of neutral, solid move here, like putting a rook on d8 or c8, or maybe even a move like bishop to f6. And then the position, I think, remains quite balanced and very close to equal. But instead, black went for f6 here, which is very logical and I think very, very ambitious, because he's just insisting on playing the move g5, and if black is able to get this in, white is just going to be losing a piece. So I really underestimated this move at first. Initially I thought that I could just play a move like h5 here, but then during the game I immediately started hesitating, because after h5 and a move like, let's say, queen f7 or queen f5, it just feels like black is going to be able to pick up this pawn, or I have to start doing stuff like g4 to hold on to my pawns, and this is really going to backfire because I'm making a ton of weaknesses. Maybe queen f5 here is better, just to avoid g4 altogether. So I really wasn't sure what to do here, but I realized I should probably at least take on c5. I had some idea of what I was going to do after that, but I knew I should definitely start with this move. Because now if black recaptures with a piece, then I can get this tempo with knight to d4. And I think my bishop is going to be pretty safe here, especially once black is taken with the knight on c5. Bare minimum, I'll always have the square on c7 for my bishop, and then I can try to evacuate it with a move like b4. So this would be definitely more than okay for white, as I'm getting to play against the isolated queen pawn now, and I'm getting this d4 square, and it seems like all of white's pieces are doing well. But instead, black recaptured b takes c5, which I think is definitely consistent. And now I decided to take on e4. So this was kind of my plan. After d takes e4, I was counting on this move bishop f1 with the threat of bishop c4 and pinning black's queen. So black has to spend a tempo getting out of that threat, and then I have time to eventually move my knight, and my bishop will be safe as well, as I kind of calculated previously. Instead, it turns out I really should have just gone with h5 in this position after trading on c5. And the point here is that if black ever ends up going after this h5 pawn, it's just going to take too much time for the queen to make all those moves, and white has a lot of resources in the position. So for example, let's say black plays queen f5 here. I can take on e4, d takes e4, and play a move like knight h4. And then if black takes the pawn on h5, I simply have rook d7, and white is just winning a piece here, and game over. I mean, black does have moves like g5, but they're definitely not going to cut it. For one, white can first take one bishop and then take the second, but also black's king side here is just opening up so much that it's definitely hard to believe this could ever work out for black. So yeah, that was definitely a miss. You know, I considered this move at first, then I thought the pawn was going to be loose and hanging, and I didn't really do much calculation after that, which was definitely a mistake. Because tactics and strategy are often working together, and you do have to use tactics to justify your strategic goals. So this would have been, I think, promising white a nice advantage, because now I'm really fixing black's light squares here. And if black doesn't go after the pawn, then I'm still going to take on e4 and play knight h4, maybe bishop f1, and start going after those light squares. So this would really be troublesome for black. Well, okay, I took on e4, d takes e4, bishop f1. I had my idea, so at least I felt like I was still putting black under a lot of pressure here. And here black played king h7, which to me seemed like the most natural move. Bishop c4, queen f5. And now my bishop here is no longer in danger of being trapped, because once the queen has moved off of e6, I now have bishop d6 in every position. So this is kind of the resource I was counting on. Now all I have to do is save my knight from being attacked, and g5 is not really a concern because I'll just have bishop d6, and all black is doing is leaving himself with more weaknesses. So then the question is where white's knight should go. Should it go to d2, e1, or h2? Because I really wasn't sure which one of these options was best. This might be a good positional puzzle if you guys want to pause the video and try to figure out for yourselves where should you put white's knight, and why is this the best square. I think there is a very clear answer, and I was happy to figure it out during the game. Okay, so I feel like the best move here for white is to put the knight on e1. And this has to do with just understanding that black's next moves and incoming play are all going to be based around this d3 square. If we look at black's pieces, it's like the knight on a6 is clearly just a terrible piece. It's on the side of the board, not doing anything. Seems very likely that in the next few moves, black will just want to play knight b4, knight d3, and try to use this strong square on d3. So after some thought, eventually I just felt like, okay, my knight on h2 is not going to be doing anything. I don't get anything from, let's say, advancing g4. The knight on d2 seemed particularly passive and not really having any prospects from there. And the knight on e1 definitely looked like an extremely passive square for the knight, but at least I was covering d3, and so I felt like strategically this was going to be good for white in the long run, because I'm definitely restricting one of black's main ideas in the position. So I was definitely happy to find this move and end up playing it. Okay, so here black played rook a d8. And I should have just played a simple move here, like maybe queen e2, just kind of keeping everything solid and under control. But I decided to go for it with queen a3. I did some calculation here, and I felt like I could get away with this, so it made sense. My point is that I'm just hitting the knight on a6, and I'm very much ready to grab the pawn on e7 if black allows. So if black had played the move knight to b4, I would have taken on a7 here, and I felt like I could get away with this because bishop on b7 is hanging, bishop on e7 is hanging, and black doesn't have such a comfortable way to defend or to counterattack here. So I think this is working for white. In the game, black first played queen to c8, just covering the knight and not willing to part ways with the pawn. I thought this was pretty logical. And finally, I pushed h5, just so I don't have to worry about g5 anymore. Okay, then came knight to b4. So I kind of, as promised, took on a7, since I'm now somewhat committed. And black played queen c6, which I'd kind of been anticipating, since I felt like this was how he was going to try to get counterplay for the pawn. As now rook a8 is definitely a serious threat, and black really wants to drop the knight on d3. In a position where I can never take it and allow him to open up this diagonal for the queen and bishop. So this was definitely an interesting move, but it kind of falls short. Black could have just gone for it with knight d3, as I found out after the game. During the game, I wasn't quite sure if black could do this or not. I felt like maybe it's not quite enough, but as it turns out, yeah, black is definitely getting enough play. In fact, the knight is kind of untouchable. If I do take on d3 here, e takes d3, let's say bishop takes d3, with check, black happily sacrifices the exchange for the light squared bishop, rook takes d3, queen c6, and white is lost. I can defend the mate with a move like e4, and this actually does save white, because queen takes c4, I'll have f3, and I'm not getting mated. But the problem is black has a second threat, rook a8 in the position. And because of this one, now white is just losing the queen and is going to be too much material down. So after e takes d3, I can also play rook takes d3. And then the engine finds just a super nice move, bishop f3. Just fixing this bishop, you know, right in white's face on the light squares, and queen h3 is coming, and yeah, white is just probably getting mated here. So after knight d3, white would need to just ignore the knight with a move like rook to b1, and then black is totally fine. Minimum can even take on f4, and if g takes f4, black has rook takes d1, rook takes d1, queen g4 check, king f1, and apparently black should actually just be content with making a draw by perpetual here with queen h3 check and back to g4. If black takes this rook on d1, white will take on b7, and white will have a ton of compensation for the exchange. Bishop on e7 is hanging, pawn on e4 is hanging with check, and white still has a pretty dangerous grip on the light squares. We can imagine queen takes e4 followed by bishop d3 is going to be extremely dangerous for black. So white is actually just better in this position. But black doesn't need that and could at least just repeat moves here and force a draw. So that was pretty interesting. I was definitely surprised that this move knight d3 ends up just creating enough counterplay for black to equalize here, but yeah, that was the case. That light squared bishop on b7 just has a ton of potential in these positions, so whenever it opens up, this is typically very, very dangerous. Okay, so in the game we got queen to c6. This gives white an extra tempo to try and consolidate the extra pawn. I played queen a4 here, and black definitely doesn't want to trade pawns, so he played queen to b6. And here I started thinking, because I realized things are still not very easy at all. Black wants to play either bishop c6 or rook to a8, and my queen is extremely awkward here. Maybe both of these moves are coming. The a2 pawn is definitely super loose. So I took my time here, and I was just trying to figure out like what's the most active way white to proceed. This is definitely a good time to pause the video if you want to challenge yourself and try to figure out what's white's best continuation here. I think there's only one clear move that gives white a very, very serious advantage, and everything else basically allows black to get huge counterplay. So I was definitely happy to have found the move, as otherwise the game would have been quite tough. Okay, if you want more time, you can pause the video. But the right move was rook to d7. So a really important move, and actually dealing with both of these threats very effectively. At first glance, I thought the move was crazy because it's just walking into bishop c6. But then I noticed that bishop c6, white will have a response of queen a7. So black's queen is hanging and doesn't have any good squares, is forced to trade on a7. White can take back with the rook, keeps the extra pawn, keeps the attack on the bishop, defends the a2 pawn, and seems like white is just cruising in this endgame. So bishop c6 is not working for black. The other move I had to calculate was rook to a8. And here if queen b5, I think this is definitely possible because in the endgame, black's two bishops are going to be under attack, and this is definitely a big problem for black. But I think even better is the move bishop c7, which is just a nice counter idea. So I'm hitting black's queen. If rook takes a4, I take on b6. And now in addition to both bishops hanging, the rook is also under attack, so black is just completely lost here. And after anything else, like queen takes c7, I just recapture, and my queen on a4 is protected. So black is just losing way too much material here as well. So after this move, rook d7, black just doesn't have any active moves, and I'm threatening not only bishop c7, but of course just to take the bishop on e7, and black doesn't have a way to counter all these threats. Like if rook e8, just happily going bishop c7 here, and it's game over. So after rook d7, he thought for a while and ended up going with bishop to c6. as this is kind of black's best chance. I play queen a7, we traded queens, and rook to d7. So I decided to trade rooks. I'm up a pawn, and I went into like technical mode where I'm trying to just limit my opponent's counterplay as much as possible and try to win the game without allowing any counter chances. I think I did a pretty reasonable job here. I started with a3, kicking the knight back. He had to go back to c6. Now knight d3 is no longer promising anything. Bishop d5, hitting the e4 pawn, f5, and f3. I thought this was quite clever because I'm threatening to just take another pawn on e4, and if black takes on f3, then I have an easy way to get my knight back into the game, as well as my king. My king can come to f2, and I think I'm just making excellent progress here. So after f3, black played rook to a8. I pushed a4. Rook went back to d8. I took on e4, and he played this move, knight to b4. I saw this coming, so I wasn't too panicked by this, and I figured I would already have this move, bishop to b7. Normally, I wouldn't want to just put my piece out in kind of outer space where it's just floating and hanging, but the only way black can attack it is rook to b8, and I have the square covered, so my bishop on b7 is kind of secure. I'm also somewhat dominating the knight on b4, so I was very much looking forward to trying to just ram this pawn home as quickly as possible. So bishop e7, black finally takes on e4, bishop takes e4 check, king g8, and now I'm 2 pawns up. So I felt like the game was very, very close to just being finished. I went with knight d3 here because trades are definitely good. Knight takes d3, bishop takes d3, and I had to be a little bit precise here, and I noticed already that bishop takes a4 is not going to be working due to bishop c4 check. And then I take on a4 for free. So instead, bishop c6 was played, and I think most players would have just given the check right away, and then black's king moves, and white is 2 pawns up and is very close to winning. But I didn't love this because now the rook is potentially coming into d2, or if I play rook c2, then the rook will come into d1. I don't think black is getting quite enough counterplay there, but you don't want to have to deal with this annoying rook if you don't have to. So instead of giving the check, I think I found a much more accurate move, and that was the move rook to c3. So now my point is I want to give bishop c4 check and then immediately play rook to d3 and challenge for the file. And so I'm just not giving black a chance to come in with the rook. At first glance, this looks very shaky because I'm just defending the bishop with my rook. It kind of runs into bishop f6. But again, I have bishop c4 check, king has to move, rook d3. Everything is under control. White is just 2 pawns up, and black's rook is not getting active. So I was definitely happy about this one. Okay, he played the best try, king f8. Now if I play bishop c4, he'll of course come in with the rook, but I'm not forced to do anything here. In fact, bishop f6 is still not a threat because I have rook takes c5. Then if rook takes d3, I'm going to take the bishop on c6. So I just play the calm move king f2. Now again, after bishop f6, I'm just going to take on c5. And I was thinking bishop takes a4 here was the most likely choice. Rook takes d3, also possible. I take on c6, take on b3. But white keeps 2 extra pawns, and this pawn is coming to a6. The bishop on f4 is super solid. I also have the tactic bishop takes h6 if I want to take another pawn. And I think almost anything here is basically winning for white. So yeah, I was also looking at bishop takes a4 here, but I would just calmly recapture, takes a5, and I think white is just slowly winning this one bit by bit. Black really doesn't have many chances there. So after king f2, black plays bishop to e8, just hitting the h5 pawn, and I decided to play bishop g6. And now black has a tough choice because he doesn't really want to trade pieces because he's down 2 pawns, but if he moves his bishop away, then his king on f8 looks very shaky, and I'm already thinking about playing like e4 and bringing my rook to f3. So he takes on g6, h takes g6, and plays rook a8. I think he just started switching to, rather than looking for counterplay in a position where there is none, he just tries to defend as stubbornly as possible. But now there are threats in the position. For example, rook a6 is definitely an idea, just targeting the g6 pawn, but white kind of has everything under control here. In fact, I even felt even if I give this pawn, then my extra a pawn is still enough to kind of decide the game. But king f3, and I'm not even losing the pawn. After rook a6, I would have this move b4. Can't take because of rook c8 check, and after rook takes a4, b takes c5, the c-pawn is running to c7, and it's just very, very strong. So this is not really playable for black. After king f3, he tried king e8. I played bishop e5, hitting the g7 pawn, and bishop f8. Then I played king e4, rook a6, and king f5. And here it's like, okay, white has everything under control, 2 pawns up, but you still have to actually win the game. I tried really hard just not to rush here and just really take my time playing e4, g4, and just preparing the final breakthrough. I felt like I could also win the game eventually by just trying to transfer my king over to like c4, b5, and then just running the a-pawn to promotion. This is very likely just an easily winning plan, but okay, I decided really not to rush here. So king d7, rook d3 check, king went back, I pushed e4. Black can't really do anything but shuffle. I pushed g4, king e8, and rook h3. Now my plan was to break with g5, and then after h takes g5, I don't really need to take back the pawn, but rather play like rook h8 or rook to h7 and then go after the g7 pawn, which seems just like a very straightforward winning plan. So he played rook b6. Now I have to worry about the b3 pawn. I pushed g5, h takes g5, and then I threw in a5. So the point of this move was to kind of see where his rook is going. I was actually expecting rook b5 here, just to keep the rook as active as possible. Then my plan was to push a6, rook a5, and then rook h8. Now I kind of calculated he can't take here because bishop takes g7 and I'm just winning a piece. So black is forced to play king e7. Then I come back to h7, and after, let's say, rook takes a6, bishop takes g7, white is just getting a pretty easily won rook endgame because I have an extra pawn, my rook on g7 is super strong, and in particular it's the king activity that really does the job here for white, because I'm just ready to push my pawns forward, king comes to f6, and I'm definitely promoting. For example, king f8, I can give this check and then just start running the pawns forward. I calculated one nice line here. Let's say black runs with g4. Of course I can't take because I'll lose the g6 pawn and then I'll lose my rook. But I can just advance forward myself, and white is eventually getting there first. g3. Rook d7 I think is an accurate move. g2, e7, and we're promoting with mate next move. If rook a8, we have rook d8 check and game over. So I didn't really calculate that far. I just kind of felt like the rook endgame should be a win, and that was kind of enough for me. In any case, in the game after a5, black went rook a6, which I felt like was less critical because now I can just put my bishop on c3. The a5 pawn is well defended, and I'm just going to take my time and pick up the g7 pawn very soon. Rook d6 was played, rook h8, king e7, rook h7, and here black resigned because I'm just taking on g7, and he is just not getting any sufficient drawing chances here. So good time to call it a day. I was definitely pleased with this game. I felt like I played most of it pretty well. The middle game definitely could have been a lot more accurate, and black had chances to, I think, create a lot of dynamic counterplay. So it was very far from like a perfect game or anything like that. But I think I played reasonably well. I found a couple of nice moves there, and my technique was definitely good enough once I had like the extra pawn or two to just bring it home pretty smoothly. Also, one thing that's kind of interesting about this game and the previous game that I won as well is that in both games it was all about this like weakness on the g7 square. In the previous game I was playing black and it was the b2 pawn that I was targeting. Here I was playing white and my pieces are all concentrated on the g7 pawn, and both games ended basically as soon as I was able to pick this pawn up. So it was kind of a funny little symmetry there. Okay, so at this point I now had 2 wins in a row after a pretty bad streak in the middle, and I was back to an even score, which was definitely felt like I was back to life, and that was kind of nice. 2 more rounds from here. I'll see you guys in the next one. Thanks and take care.